This is Chris Heasley with the Chris Heasley Radio Show. The dispersion of the Wuhan flu in 2020 presented an opportunity for governments of every type across our country to go full totalitarian. But it was one government in particular that laid out the model by which all governments would follow. And that was the government of the state of Ohio, led by the current Republican governor, Mike Dewine. And he initiated a totalitarian endeavor by first appearing on the Tucker Carlson show, stating that he had discovered 100,000 incidences of the Wuhan virus, a virus that had never been contained, and yet Mike Dewine was ready to go full Joseph Stalin mode on the people of Ohio. He then elevated the chief medical officer for the state of Ohio, whose name is Amy Acton, and a woman who had a career not so much in medical treatment, but rather in attaining grant money for our precious vaccines. He elevated her and placed her on a platform where everyone would know her name, giving an unelected bureaucrat incredible influence and power in the state of Ohio. Then the first statewide mask order happened, where the governor, for the first time in the state's history, would require every Ohioan to wear something on their person. He would now dictate how you go out in public. You no longer have the freedom to do so. And of course, shortly thereafter, the push for forced vaccinations happened. Rhetoric and social pressure throughout the state to get vaccinated was overbearing. And throughout this ordeal, police were inappropriately used to implement these dictates. They were no longer implementing the law, but rather the dictates of Mike Dewine. This model would be replicated at every school district, village, borough, county, and state government across the USA. Mike Dewine took the first step for a totalitarian spree across the country. His dedication and commitment to the globalist effort is unmatched, and globalists across the planet are indebted to the communist that is Mike Dewine. But you see, Mike Dewine is a charitable man, and he often lets you know that as he is rolling out his totalitarian spree, that at his heart he is charitable. He is charitable because he invests in Haitian orphanages. That is an interesting development. A man from cold and rainy Northeast Ohio, from the frozen banks of Lake Erie, from Cleveland, a city with more charitable organizations than one could imagine with city basketball leagues and homeless shelters, and yet somehow he finds him investing in the tropical island of Haiti in Haitian orphanages. Haiti, an island of a certain particular interest to the American political class. Haiti, in close proximity to Epstein Island. Haiti, where the story, as I understand it, where a woman named Laura Silsby was arrested by Haitian officials for attempting to clean out the Haitian orphanages. She spent 6 months in a Haitian jail before the Clintons sent an envoy to negotiate successfully for her release. She then, as I understand it, returned to work for a company that puts out Amber Alerts for missing children. Haiti, where Monica Peterson, a young and aspiring reporter, arrived to Haiti to investigate human trafficking and just so happened to commit suicide within a short time of arriving in Haiti. Haiti, an island where Haitians have a particular disdain for American politicians and for their charitable nature that they have towards the Haitian country. Go look up Haitians' disdain for American politicians. Millie Weaver. Millie Weaver was on the brink of releasing a cutting-edge documentary exposing the American deep state's attempt to refute the Trump administration's agenda. And this documentary would expose the interests of John Brennan, the once head of the CIA and one of the most powerful men in America for some time. Millie Weaver, who was releasing this movie, the movie was called Shadowgate, and she is a resident of Portage County, Ohio. On the day of the release of her Shadowgate documentary, in her home in Portage County, Ohio, county police arrived at her doorstep, arresting her on charges that would later be dropped. And they threatened to take her kids into CPS services. Millie Weaver is not a person with a long criminal record, but on the one day she attempts to release a major expose of the American deep state, she has local Ohio police show up for her to arrest her. She was arrested and her children were threatened to be taken away by Children Protective Services in Portage County, Ohio, a county whose district attorney is Victor Vigalucci, who was at one time the president and on the board of trustees for the Portage County Children's Advocacy Center. He is also on the Supreme Court of Ohio Subcommittee on Child Abuse. And what we see is a revolving interest between elected officials in the state of Ohio and the globalist agenda. We see a revolving interest between elected officials in the state of Ohio and a totalitarian agenda. We see an aversion for the rights of the people of Ohio by the politicians in the state of Ohio while they hide themselves under the cover of pretending to be supposedly in the best interests of the children. And there are no accusations that are being made here. We're simply showing this set of shared interests. We're simply showing these sort of connecting dots. They all seem to align in a certain way. And it's for you to decide if there's more to be seen here, if there's more to be uncovered. We don't know. But we're just letting you know that this sort of revolving set of interests seems to exist. And this is the Chris Heasley Show. And on this show, we will bring you all of the ideas, the content, the information that you need to take back your city, your county, your state, the great state of Texas, your county, your state, and the country. But there's an obligation on you with this show, and the obligation is for you to get involved at the local level, because at the local level, we have the most bang for our buck. We have the greatest chance of restoring our country. And clearly it seems that the tentacles of the globalist cabal seem to have penetrated at the local level. In order for our governments to return to be representing the local citizens, it's up to us to get involved and remove this nefarious element from our local governments. And on today's show, we have two guests. On this phone, we should have G2. G2, are you there?
I am. Good afternoon.
Great. Happy Thanksgiving. Thanks for being on the show. It's good to hear from you. And in the studio, we have Rhonda Miller, Assistant National Director for the John Birch Society. Rhonda, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Chris. It's an honor to be here.
Great. Thank you. And Rhonda drove down from Dallas to come see us, so we appreciate her driving into the studio today. Thank you for doing that. Rhonda, tell us a little bit about yourself and John Birch Society. Give us a short introduction on yourself and your organization.
Yeah, I was a born and raised Hoosier. My husband and I just relocated to Texas to get away from the communists in Indiana. And we are honored to be here. But I didn't know about the John Birch Society until a few years ago, and met with what was then our coordinator for our region. And he and I had many conversations, and then I actually was honored to be able to come on staff last year as a field coordinator, and realized that, had I known about the John Birch Society 12 years ago when I started doing all my research, it would have made my life so much easier, because they have all the resources. So many people, I love to tell the story about the John Birch Society and why it's even named that. So John Birch was a missionary in communist China during World War II, and he had built many relationships, and ended up being well known. And when Doolittle and his raid, his comrades that had bombed, they landed in China, and an individual came to a cafe where he was at, tapped him on the shoulder, and said, "You're an American, come with me." Well, he went through the jungles and was able to get Doolittle and his crew out to safety. Well, he told General Chenault, "I want to be a chaplain in the military." Well, he didn't need a chaplain, but he needed an intelligence officer. And so John Birch signed up and became an intelligence officer, and he was very, very highly regarded. And so at the end of the war, John had a mission that he wanted to, 3 days, I think, after the war was over. There was one more mission that needed to be done, and he stayed behind, and the communists brutally murdered him in the jungles of China. A man named Robert Welch very, very smart man, graduated high school at a very young age, graduated college, went on to be a very successful businessman, but realized something was really happening in our country, and started traveling the globe and having conversations with other business people, and they realized something was really wrong. And so in 1958, he gathered some of those individuals in Indianapolis, Indiana, and laid out the blueprint, which is the Blue Book, we call it, and went over what he saw happening and the steps that needed to be taken in order to take back the country. And so these individuals joined together, and they decided to form the John Birch Society. And it was basically a grassroots organization meant to educate Americans on what was really happening to our government behind the scenes, because many of us have been lied to. We have been told one set of stories, but it's not true. And so he was, the whole point of the John Birch Society is to educate people on the truth. And we have a large library. We have a huge vault of everything communism, exposing what was really happening and who was behind it, who was controlling our government at the highest levels behind the scenes. And so it's very honoring and humbling to be a part of JBS and to help Americans at the grassroots level through chapters, local chapters that we set up, helping them understand the Constitution, first of all, because many of us have no idea about the Constitution, and then helping them understand this is what you need to do at the grassroots level to be the pullers of the oar. You talked about people needed to take action at their local level, right? So that's the whole point. They need to become pullers of the oars, not passengers in the boat. And I have to say, prior to 2010, I was a passenger in the boat, as many of us have been throughout our life. But realizing we have a responsibility to take our government back for we the people, and that is what the John Birch Society helps individuals do at the grassroots level.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting. You know, we see this repeated theme of military men sort of smelling a rat before anyone else does, right? Military men becoming suspicious of our own government before anyone else does. And Robert Welch was over there in the jungles, knew something was wrong, and use that as a motivation for him to come back to America and do something about it. This is a repeated theme. If you look at the Venona intercepts, the Venona intercepts were even before that. In World War II, you had FDR, who appears that he was a committed communist and was aligned with a foreign agenda, not necessarily our own agenda. And what happened is military men became aware of this, and they illegally began spying on RFK, excuse me, on FDR and his communist cabinet, and this was called the Venona intercepts. And the NSA came out of that work. But that's a very interesting story. So, what can you tell me more about the John Birch Society? What are some of the things that it's involved in today?
So we are still exposing the communist agenda, right? We're exposing what's happening to our children. We've really gone after the pornography, which you talked about trafficking earlier, and exposing who's behind the pornography push into our schools. It's the WEF, the United Nations, and their propaganda arms of the publishing companies. And how that's happening, we work with individuals at the local level. We help them understand why it's important to get out of the United Nations and why the United Nations was even founded and what it's really doing at the local level. Many people do not understand. It sounds like a big globalist agenda when you talk about the UN, but helping them understand, and I have different presentations that I give, helping them understand this is what it looks like at the local level. This is what they're doing to usurp your power. And I have the documents that talk about how they're revamping, and it's their own words, they're revamping the local balance of power, taking it away from we the people. And so helping people understand that this is what's really going on. That's the whole mission of the John Birch Society, is educating the people and then empowering them, giving them the tools and the resources that they need so that they can go and they can hold their government responsible.
Yeah, I really think that some of these illicit practices are built into the foundations of our own government. And so if you look at the movie American Made with Tom Cruise, what the entire premise of that movie is that it's our own elected officials that initiated the drug running scheme, and they did it through Mena, Arkansas, where they were dropping while Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas, they would fly in boatloads of cocaine, drop it into Mena, Arkansas, and then they would disperse from there. And just a criminal enterprise of epic proportions grew out of that, where they were able to buy off more politicians, get the globalist agenda even more infiltrated in our communities, initiate the human trafficking business model that we see today. And so there's a sheriff, and I apologize, I'm not going to remember his name, but he's a really prominent sheriff in Florida. And what he's doing is he's doing these, he's now putting pressure on our own government. So in other words, when he sees human trafficking, what he's starting to do is say, this stuff is beyond the level of a local county sheriff. You have to look at the foundations of your society, which is at the federal government. And you have to look at them with a suspicious lens because they, I don't want to make any accusations, but where there's smoke, there's fire, and it seems to be coming from something deeply embedded in our own country. And so, but go ahead and tell me about, we talked a little bit about Indiana and your work there and what you saw there. And I think that's what your motivation was to get involved in the John Birch Society.
It was, because when I started understanding what was really happening and started looking at how our elected officials were operating, one of my passions was to save our children from the indoctrination in our schools, but also the sexual grooming, which leads into the trafficking. And then realizing that, many of our states had adopted legislation after Alfred Kinsey wrote his books, and we'll talk about him hopefully a little bit later. But our states then made it legal for our schools and our public libraries to distribute pornography, which comes down from the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, and we have the direct links proving so. But helping to understand that we've got to save our children from this, and realizing that our elected officials, even in the state of Indiana, we're supposed to be a red state, right? Well, I tell people we're red, but it's not conservative red, it's communist red. And we have a governor right now who's on the CCP friendly governor list, and I have the report to prove it. So you're looking at these Republicans and how they're pushing back against saving children from pornography, and it really opened my eyes, and it really forced me to dig my heels in. And so our national field director at the time was our field coordinator, John Schrock, and he and I stood shoulder to shoulder at the State House for 3 years and fought back against what was happening within the Republican Party in Indiana, because they didn't want to save children from this. We had a very strong Senator Jim Toms out of Evansville, who was our champion to save our children. He's an older gentleman, and I just love him dearly. He took bullets inside the caucus. I mean, they were literally demonizing him and just giving him a really hard time in the Republican caucus because he was trying to save children from pornography in the schools. And we had built him a library. We would give him books after books after books that we were finding every year, and showing him the material that was available to children. And so he would show it to people. But the Republicans in the state of Indiana were pushing back. So it really opened my eyes to the corruption within the Republican Party in a conservative state like Indiana. And it just emboldened me to fight harder. And it took us 3 years, but we did overturn the state statute in Indiana that legally made it possible for schools to distribute pornography to our kids. So at this point, you cannot do that in the state of Indiana because it's illegal. Now we're going after the public libraries. But that was the whole point of where I got involved. And in the process, I met Dr. Judith Reisman, who was the leading expert on Alfred Kinsey. And then I understood why we were even fighting that bill and why 43 states then have it because of what he did. And so it was through that process that really made me an activist, and then led me to John Truck, and then led me to the John Birch Society, and be able to tap into those resources that JBS has been fighting this agenda since 1958 when it was founded. But in 1966, Gary Allen wrote Sex Education Problems, a little booklet that I have copies of that I take with me. He was warning about what was happening with this perversion that was coming into our schools.
Okay, so who is Kinsey? You keep mentioning the word Kinsey. Who is this guy?
So Alfred Kinsey was born in New Jersey. He during World War II, he moved to Indiana. He was doing some very violent things in his attic of his home in New Jersey. He moves to Indiana during World War II, and he somehow gets connected with the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers start funding his sex research at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. And he then gets involved with the president of IU. He's got students that he's grooming through this process. He's having pornographic escapades, sexual escapades in the attic of his home. He is involved in pedophiles, collecting statistics from pedophiles. He's training them how to rape and molest children and use a stopwatch to time their thing to determine that children are sexual from birth through the orgasms. There's a table 34 in the male volume of his research, if you will, if you want to call it that. It's all fraudulent data, and it's been proven time and time again. But it was all based on crimes against children that determined they were sexual from birth, which then led to Hugh Hefner reading his books when he was a virgin in college and deciding he was going to become Kinsey's pamphleteer. That's when Playboy started. But the thing is, Kinsey was a sexual deviant. Obviously, you can't do that to children without having crimes involved. But the Rockefellers funded him, and the CIA protected him through their MK Ultra experiments, because Kinsey was given access to mental health hospitals where he was able to experiment on women and children. He was collecting all this data. There was a Nazi in Germany who was sending him statistics of what he was doing to children. And in his Nuremberg trial, the judge asked him, "Why were you sending this information to Kinsey?" And he said, "Because Kinsey asked for it." But here in the United States, Kinsey was never tried. And so that is the basis from which we have all of this perversion going on in our society today, is because the Rockefellers funded it, the CIA protected it, and Kinsey was their tool.
G2, I know you've done a lot of work in Indiana. Do you have any observations on this?
Well, I don't think it's specific to Indiana. You made mention of something that I think most people have a hard time grasping, which is this idea that there is, in fact, no law protecting children in school from being exposed to pornography. Almost, I would say, the supermajority of Americans believe that no matter what state they're in, there is some law against child pornography being distributed through schools by libraries and teachers. But you're saying that's, in fact, not true, that there are not laws in most states protecting children from being exposed to pornography in the schools. And what I found is, of course, it is not true. There is no law protecting children in most states. Now, some laws are coming up. You mentioned one that you were fighting to get through, and you got through. But let's think about this. The broad exposure of child pornography in the schools came out in around that 2020 period during the lockdowns, when parents got a look at what their kids were being exposed to. And a lot of parents then found these books and book lists on school websites as recommended reading. They found their children were being exposed to them by these teachers. And so they went into the libraries of their schools to see if these books were really there. And there are about 100 of these books that are legitimately child pornography. They aren't kind of or sort of, or it's not a loose interpretation. These are books that are sexually explicit, that depict young children having sex with each other, or in some cases they talk about children having sexual relationships with teachers. And then people say, well, that's at college level. No, it's not. No. These books are present at elementary, middle, and high schools. Elementary schools have books that are sexually explicit and suggestive, and most of them are on this LGBTQ side. You don't find heterosexual adult relationship pornography in schools. You only find this sort of alternative world depicted in these books. So I think your base premise, which you moved through pretty thoroughly, but I just want to reemphasize the fact that if you're a listener and you don't know this, it is highly likely that in your school there is child pornography. Now, Chris, you had on a Texas school board member talking about this about 6 months ago. I can't remember when. And so we know that this is actually present. Now, how did this happen? How did this roll out across all these schools? You make a great point when you go back to the Kinsey studies. That's true. But I'm sure, given what you said as you came into this, you're aware of the January 10, 1963 list of goals read into the congressional record. And for the listeners who aren't, I suspect you are. On January 10 of 1963, a representative named Kurlong read into the record a list of the goals of the Communist Party. And one of those, and this would be number 24. Eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. Okay. Then it said, this is number 25, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. 26, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. And then if you get down to 41, it is emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influences of parents, attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and retarding of children to suppressive influence of parents. There's more to this. There are 45 goals that were read into the congressional record in 1963. And as you go through those, you see nearly all of them being manifest today in our society. So I just wanted to take one of the things you mentioned relatively quickly and expand on that and say, look, there has been an organized effort for decades to put child pornography in these schools through the library associations, the National School Board Associations, through the universities that educate our teachers, and then run all the conferences that teachers go to get additional accreditation. All of those organizations have been pushing this agenda for a very, very long time. And, of course, you said this a moment ago. At the core of it all are the publishing houses that create the curricula that our children are exposed to. And if you get a look at what your child's curricula is now, you may find that it is radical. It is far more focused on indoctrination than on actual education of fundamental core knowledge like math, science, reading skills, critical thinking. So is what I just said consistent with what you've seen as you've been doing this work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought up those communist goals, because every time I would go to the State House and testify to repeal our obscenity exemption statute that 43 states have, thanks to Kinsey, I would always read those communist goals. And they got so sick and tired of hearing them. At one point, I had a legislator, a Democrat, by the way, a radical Democrat, really go after me over the fact that I was reading those goals. And I said, I'll continue to read them. I don't care what you say. I will continue to read them because this is what we're dealing with. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. The other thing I would say is you touched on the associations. And so that's another real passion of mine, is exposing the foundations that are funding those associations. So I've been telling people, as you have been pushing back on your school board, as you have been pushing back on your public library, you need to understand that when your elected officials get onto the school board, they are sent off for indoctrination themselves, and they are told this is how it works. Well, the School Board Association is part of or affiliated with the Arabella Advisors. So if people who haven't heard about the Arabella Advisors, I encourage them to go do some research, because it ties into Renee Wormser's foundations, Their Power and Influence. Renee Wormser was a counsel on the Reese Committee. Well, the Reese Committee was set up in the 50s, I think it was, to investigate the foundations. And he determined that they are essentially the fourth branch. We know we have three branches of government in the United States, but we didn't know we had a fourth. And the fourth branch is these foundations, this interlocking network of them that are incredibly powerful. Well, the most powerful network is the Arabella Advisors Network. And so Arabella Advisors funds a lot of these associations through their tentacles that is essentially controlling things. So when parents get pushback from the school boards, that is why, because they have then become indoctrinated on how to push back on the parents, and they operate within this network. Same thing with public libraries. When parents are and citizens are finding all this pornography in their public libraries, they're going to the library boards, which the library boards are appointed by our elected officials. And so they're pushing back, but these library boards are then using the American Library Association talking points, and they are pushing back on the taxpayers who are funding the public library, telling them it's a First Amendment and you're banning books. Well, the American Library Association is
exactly what was in. Yeah, that's exactly what you just said is exactly what's in those January 10, 1963 comments, right?
Yes.
If you say we shouldn't have child pornography in the schools, then the counter is, well, you're trying to ban books. And we remember throughout the entirety of, 22, 23, and now 24, we've had constant claims that parents were trying to ban books. What I would see is parents would go to school board meetings, and I've been to school board meetings in a few different districts to to see that it is consistent across many districts. But parents would go into these school districts and read books from that school district shelf. They would take books right out of the libraries for the elementary, middle, and high schools and read them in open school board meetings. And I've seen school boards shut down their meetings and leave the room saying that the material being read is too pornographic to be read in public. Well, if it's too pornographic to be read in public, what is it doing in an elementary, middle, or high school? And this is a new thing. For those that, maybe wouldn't be aware, there was no pornography in American schools. I would say more than 15 years ago, absolutely, there was no pornography. There was great world literature, some of which had scenes in it that might have been aggressive, but this is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is intensely explicit, crystal clear, often illustrated with drawings, sexual material. This is pornography, and it's mostly child pornography. So you hit on a bunch there as you go through those relationships. And Arabella Advisors, you are right to point out, in the World Economic Forum, of course, if you go and look at their list of supporters, involve companies we do business with all the time. There are a lot of organizations that have been pushing this ideology, and we've all seen it, because if you resist it all, if you question it, you're called radical. So much so that the parents that were going to school boards and reading this child pornography in the open light of day to the school boards themselves were then listed by the Department of Homeland Security as terrorists on the terrorist update. I can't remember if it was 21 maybe. I can't remember what year it was. But there was an update to the terrorist watch list, the terrorist document that is put out frequently by our Department of Homeland Security, and they actually put on there parents who go to school board meetings and challenge those school boards as a terrorist threat to the United States. So it is organized. It is in that NGO, nonprofit world. It's in all the associations for the school boards and associations for librarians, and it is in our government.
Right, and I think the other thing is that this entity that is implementing this agenda on us, they are committed for the long haul. So this is generational. They've started this more than 100 years ago. G2 mentioned 1963 when the Communist Manifesto became available, showing an intent to separate the child from the parent, an attempt to sort of bastardize the parent. But if you look back to 1919 in Germany, there was a man named Magnus Hirschfeld, and he was funded by the corporate interests at that time, all with Marxist leaning, all with communist leanings, and he sort of set the template by which this perversion was created and is being implemented today. The same terms, the same ideas, the same concepts. He implemented a sexual institute in Frankfurt, Germany, and it had the worst intentions for the children. The outward goal of this ultimately was to normalize pedophilia and to begin the sale of children to adults. And ultimately, the Germans shut it down, and then they burned his pornographic material. And to this day, the American left cites that book burning as something bad, when the Germans were actually attempting to protect their children. So in all instances, we see the parents be the bad guys, portrayed as the bad guys, this perversion portrayed as some sort of a moral necessity that we have to implement on our lives. And that's what the storytellers tell us since the beginning of time. We have the highest organizations implementing it today, the WEF. They have the money, they have the foundations. And I think that what we have is in our billionaire class, these men have become sort of unattached they're ungrounded. I think that when you attain that sort of wealth, that you become ungrounded and you become sort of open to these really grotesque ideas. I don't know if anyone has another concept, but clearly it's being implemented on us by the men that run the foundations of the world. Do you have any opinion on that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it was all, you have to break down the fabric of the family. In order to take down a country, you have to destroy the morality and you have to break up the family. And as G2 alluded to, Communist Goal number 41 talks about that. You have to remove the child from the family. And I think that is where we're at. We're seeing the children being so indoctrinated that they're turning on their parents, which is by design. They are being sexually groomed. They're being shown that pedophilia is normal, so that when they are sold off into sex trafficking, they won't think anything about it. They'll think it's normal behavior. And so that is how they're breaking down our society, is through morality and through this perversion. And so far, they're being very successful.
I consider it a Sun Tzu tactic being placed on our country. Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, in his military philosophy, he always would say that you infiltrate from within before you put a soldier on the battlefield. Before you put any boots on the grounds, you rot the society from the inside out. And that means that you go after the foundations of society, which is the family element. And I consider this agenda to be a military tactic. I consider it to be an act of treason. And I certainly hope that at one point in time, justice is delivered. So you were saying about something about Ken Paxton having a court case coming up. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Texas passed a state statute that requires online pornography sites to have age restrictions to protect children from online porn. So Texas passed the state statute. In Indiana, they did it, I think, in 2023. But the porn industry joined forces, as they always do, and they went after Ken Paxton. So they're suing Ken in the state of Texas, and it's worked its way through the system. So it is now going to be heard at the Supreme Court January 15th. One of our colleagues and our fellow John Birch Society members, Audrey Werner from the Matthew 18 group, has a amicus brief that we've supported, and she will that will be presented on January 15th at the Supreme Court. So it'll be interesting to see. There are a lot of attorneys generals now that have their own amicus brief that will be heard the same day. As I understand it, the Supreme Court normally hears at least 2 cases a day. They have cleared the entire docket, and they are focusing just on this case on January 15th. It has huge ramifications. If the Supreme Court were to rule in our favor and in the favor of the state of Texas, it could start to unravel all of those laws that were put into place based on the Kinsey crimes against children. So it's going to be a big day, January 15th. Again, I'm hoping to be able to travel out to D.C. with Audrey and her team and be able to be there when they hear his amicus brief in this case. So it's a big deal.
So what we did is we actually covered that on our show. And what happened is we had some guests on, and we talked about what Pornhub was doing. And essentially our message was that, Pornhub, they were sort of in battle mode, and they are well-funded, and they certainly can take on Ken Paxton. But at the same time, they're looking like a gross set of perverts to every parent in the state of Texas. That was our message to Pornhub. We sort of said, we know you can put up a battle, but you're looking like a predator to our children. That video was delivered to Pornhub management, and they sort of came out of their hole and started to talk openly about things. And one of the things that happened is what they're sort of doing now is they're presenting themselves as the industry standard, because of course they are more in line with the laws because they have the money to be in line with the laws. And of course there are other sites out that are much more egregious. And so what Pornhub is saying is, hey, make us the standard, right? Because we're not as bad as some of the stuff that's out there. Make us the standard. And they're attempting to attain credibility with that. I think that is a completely nonsensical position. The stuff that's on Pornhub is disgusting and bizarre, weird, gross. And there's stuff out there that's worse. But this attempt for us to set the bar at what they're doing as normal, that's one more step to normalize our processes. And so, but you said some other things about this Pornhub ruling. It can unravel other things. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the hope is that once the Supreme Court hears this ruling, that they would rule in favor of Ken Paxton in the state of Texas, and then the amicus briefs that are going to be heard are dealing with especially Audrey's, are dealing with how we even got to this point with pornography in our country. And it's based on the crimes that Kinsey committed and the protections that he had and the laws that were then put into place. So as this amicus brief is presented, Mary McAllister, who is a colleague of Dr. Reisman's, she now serves on the Child and Parental Rights Campaign along with Bernadette Broyles. They are going to be the ones presenting this to the Supreme Court. And the idea is that when they present the fact that we are at this point in our society based on the pornography is because of the crimes of Kinsey, and that's where all these laws came into place to protect this industry, that the thought is that will start to unravel those.
Okay, what laws are in place to protect Kinsey? What other sick laws are in place?
Well, so you have age of consent laws that have been, they keep lowering the age of consent. That was based on the crimes of Kinsey. You've got the laws that I talked about earlier that 43 states adopted that protect schools and give them an educational purpose to give pornography to children. That was based on Kinsey. You've got the same protections for the public libraries. So all of those statutes will be laid out, and the whole point is to start unraveling those to protect our children. And I think that's January 15th could be pivotal in that process.
And when you say age of consent, what does that mean? Consent for what?
Consent for sex. So in many states, it's like 16, but in California, they keep lowering it, right? So different states continue to try to lower the age of consent that leads to pedophilia.
Okay, so that means consent for, in other words, sex with an adult. So in other words, it's not if two 15-year-olds go together, that's one thing. But if a 16-year-old goes with a 23-year-old, that's a different thing, is what you're saying.
Correct.
G2, do you have any thoughts on what we're talking about?
Well, California implemented a rule a couple of years ago that was quite odd, where they said if you are 14 or older, you can consent without parental consent. The child can consent to have sex with an adult that's no more than 10 years older than them, which meant that a 14-year-old could have sex with a 24-year-old, and it would be considered legal. I don't know the final status of this law or ruling, how this came into power, but obviously that would be something they would put in place, and then they would try to expand it to make it younger and younger and make that 10-year range become wider and wider until finally you would be in a position where they could just say that a pedophile is a minor attracted person, the new phrase they coined about 3 years or 4 years ago, and that a minor attracted person benefits a child by being involved in a sexual relationship with them. That's the direction this is headed. And you don't have to think real hard to get it there because you look at the moves they've actually made. Are you hearing the feedback I'm hearing? Yeah,
well, I don't know what it is. There's something going on with the studio.
And make sure your phones aren't near your microphone.
No, it's not that.
Maybe. Okay. So the
Jeff is trying to work on that right now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeff. This cultural trend that has been developing now, we've seen going back all the way to the 1963 document that quite literally lays it out in a congressional record. We know that this has been going for a long time. The Kinsey studies are really important, pivotal points where this fake science was treated as some sort of real research and the basis for additional justification of sexualizing children. And it just goes on and on. Now, it culminates in where we are right now in this country, where we have this ridiculous phrase called unaccompanied minor. So when you hear that there's an unaccompanied minor coming across the border, and they interviewed a 2-year-old a few days ago down on the border and said that she came here by herself from Ecuador. Now think about that. Can a 2-year-old go from Ecuador to Texas? Do you know any 2-year-old that could go by themselves from Houston to Dallas, from San Antonio to Lubbock? It's not possible. There is no such thing as an unaccompanied minor. Every child that crosses that border is in the control of the cartels. Now they've brought hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these unaccompanied minors and children who came across with people who posed as their parents, but in fact were just handlers. Now there's some really important, clear points that illustrate exactly what you're talking about. Senator Chuck Grassley came out about 2 months ago and did a report that showed that Health and Human Services has delivered 50 children to one address. 50 children. Now, how this works, the cartels bring them across the border. They hand them to the government. The government puts them in a retention building that's run by an outside third-party contractor that makes a lot of money. The contractor gets the children prepared to travel. They put them on a government plane, and the government then flies them to a market where they're handed to a sponsor. The question is, who is that sponsor? One person who was on the cartel list, that's a member of a transnational criminal organization list, which is about 40,000 names. There's a person on that list, or who was on that list, who applied for asylum, asking for asylum, got them off the list, and then they were used as the sponsor for 16 children. Health and Human Services gave that kid, that person, 16 kids, 16 children, and he's supposed to be the sponsor. When you've got one sponsor taking 16 children, Grassley's report, 50 children delivered to one address, and then Health and Human Services comes out and says, we can't find 320,000 or so children, around 320,000 children that were in our government's care, that were brought across the border by criminal gangs, these transnational criminal organizations, the cartels. 320,000 children are now missing. Now, that's in addition to the children that disappear in the United States. But 320,000 children were taken into the hands of our government, distributed throughout the country, and no one knows where they are. Now, some of those children have undoubtedly ended up with family members. That's certainly the case. And some of those children are simply being exploited for labor. But we know that many, many of those children are being exploited for sexual exploitation. They're being sold as prostitutes. And the phrase that the cartels came up with is, you can sell a drug once, but you can sell a child many times. So these concepts you're talking about that at the beginning sound so sort of extraordinary and seem like there should be laws against them, come right down to today in our country, we have schools across the nation in every state, including Texas, that have child pornography on the shelves. Now, Texas passed a law to stop that, so it's probably being weeded out in Texas. But they've got child pornography on the shelves. You've got the government moving children around the country and handing them to sponsors who are undoubtedly using them for sexual exploitation. That's happening right now, today, in the United States at an industrial scale. And by industrial scale, the pedophile industry globally, the last number I heard for this is $150 billion. The United States pedophile industry is between $35 and $50 billion. It has grown dramatically. It's one of the fastest growing criminal enterprises, wildly profitable. How can we, as citizens, allow that to happen in our nation? How can we allow that and we simply stand by and ignore it and pretend it isn't happening? The good news is the new administration that's incoming made a pledge to fight against it in their first term. Donald Trump worked with the U.S. Marshals to rescue kids all over the country. And now in the second Trump term, I expect that same effort led by Tom Homan with the illegal aliens to get those kids who have been trafficked by the cartels. But also, I expect them to be using the marshals to save American children as well. So I think we're going to have a fight now where finally the government is going to turn and begin to try to find and protect these children. Is that consistent with what I just went through consistent with your understanding?
Yes, it is. And I am hopeful that President Trump, he was going after them in his first term. And I do believe that when he's back into office, that they are going to be hot on the trail of going after these kids and finding these kids and protecting them.
Hey, guys, we might have a caller. Let me see. Hold on. Hello? Nope. Sorry about that. Rhonda, I'm going to let you close this out. We have this technical difficulty going on in the studio, so just go ahead and close this out. Your parting thoughts on what you think needs to happen to correct these issues and what you see coming in the future.
Well, yeah. So I think it starts with we the people, and we have to educate Americans at the local level to help them understand that this is really what's happening behind the scenes, and this is who's actually controlling things. Like I talked about the school board associations, the library association, right? Helping them understand that this is the cabal that David Rockefeller said if he's charged with this, he stands guilty and he's proud of it. I mean, they're helping them understand that these people know what they're doing, and we all have to armor up. This is our country. We are at war, and it's a spiritual battle as well. And we have to take responsibility for what's happening within our families, within our school district, and with our city and our counties. It starts there. And once we help people understand, they have to be the pullers of the oars. They have a responsibility to stand up. You can't sit on the couch and ride along. We can't do that anymore. We have to get engaged and we have to get involved. And that's what the John Birch Society is all about. And we do it through the local chapters. So you can go to jbs.org and you can sign up to be a member. You can sign up to get plugged in, and we can get you into chapters so that we can start reclaiming the ground that we've lost over these last decades.
Yeah, that Rockefeller family, they seem to have bad intentions at every turn. You know, they're the ones that in the early the Appalachian Mountains, they were filled with natural resources. Families were moving there. You know, 100 years ago, it was a booming small town civilization that was just sort of starting to grow. And so the Rockefellers go in and buy up all the natural resources in the Appalachian Mountains, make them unavailable for development, and then poverty ensues in Appalachia. The people there now don't have proper educations, don't have, you know, good incomes, nothing of the sort. And who's behind it again? The Rockefellers. So maybe that's the culprits. All right, guys. Well, this is the Chris Heasley Show. I want to thank everybody. Hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving. I want to thank Rhonda Miller from the John Birch Society. I want to thank G2. And on Saturday, we'll be back here, Chris Heasley, 10 a.m. on FM 99.5 Radio DeBang. Have a